Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for continuing to be here. I'm very impressed and deeply touched. So what I want to do in this video is to spend a minute thinking about how all of this work that we've done to understand the welfare terms, to understand the ways in which market forces do and don't produce just and efficient outcomes, can be reconciled with different political philosophies. Right? So when I think about what this tells us about, or what this might imply to us about the proper role of government, or the proper role of communities, or the proper role of markets in organizing economic activity, and really organizing the way that we live our lives. So just to recap, right? Essentially what we've said here is three deeply incompatible things. On the one hand, we've said that markets have this almost magical ability to result in coordinated, concerted, rational, and efficient outcomes from a bunch of different people who know different things, who don't have great abilities to communicate with each other, all doing their own thing, right? Markets have this amazing ability that when the price of fertilizer goes up in the Central Valley, the avocado growers in the Central Valley can have a negotiation with brunch goers in Miami without ever having to talk to each other, right? They have this amazing ability to organize chains of production and inputs and logistics on a worldwide scale, right? To decide where buttons ought to be manufactured, and where steel ought to be manufactured, and where computer chips ought to be manufactured, without ever having any sort of overall systemic concerted understanding of what those things are even used for, right? The button manufacturer doesn't even have to know what kind of shirts are being made. So markets do this amazing job, right? This amazing job of aggregating people's information and creating coherent outcomes in this complex, in this massively complex society that we live in. And it's hard to imagine how anything else could do half of what markets do in those domains. But they also don't solve and can't solve these deep problems, right? Relating to market power, relating to people's ability to form monopolies and then manipulate prices. They can't solve problems related to externalities, right? We see that we're generating massive amounts of pollution. We generate too much noise. We generate too much light, right? We have these massive problems of collective action that can't be solved or don't appear to be solvable with markets. And they can't solve the problem of cheating and lying, right? They can't solve the problem that when some people know more about their product or know more about what they're buying or what they're selling than others, they have an opportunity to take advantage of each other. And that can result in collapse in trust and disappearance of useful markets. So, and then the third thing, right, the last problem we need to solve is that even if we could solve all of that, market economies aren't going to do, by themselves, aren't going to do the job of eliminating inequality, right? They're not going to lead to just and equitable outcomes. And this is an enormous problem because every society that has anything resembling a market economy has that market economy built on top of vast, vast inequities. When you look at the early European writers, the beginning of the discussion of markets, most of this is focused on the vast inequities coming from the fact that, at the same time that market economies are emerging, you have things like enclosure in Britain, so that peasants had no legal rights to any of the land that they used. And this meant that, even if markets are resulting in Pareto efficient outcomes, they're resulting in Pareto efficient outcomes where the landlords and the aristocracy get vastly more of the benefits of society than the common people. If we talk about the United States, right, we have to think about the fact that, if we want to think about the distribution of resources in our society, we have to think about the fact that, in 1850, a large number of the people who lived in our country didn't have a legal right to own their own bodies, right? We think about the fact that throughout our society's history, we've had legal systems and cultural systems that have privileged people of some origins over others, right? We've had people entering the country with vastly different levels of wealth, and at every time that there have been opportunities to seize, right, new inventions to make, different people's ability to take advantage of those opportunities have been vastly, vastly different from each other. So that's basically the framework, right? That's the problem. The question is, what do we do about it, right? What's the right approach? So I would say the approach that most economists take, the approach that most economists take without even really thinking about it as something that there's an alternative to, is what you might call neoliberalism or market liberalism. And the idea here is to really take the welfare theorems literally. So we say, markets are great at most things, but they fail at these specific jobs, right? They fail at information asymmetries, they fail at externalities, they fail at pricing power. So the role of the government should be twofold. The first one should be to correct those market failures, right? So we say we mostly leave the market alone, but we have an antitrust division to break up monopolies, right? To make sure that we still have competitive prices, nobody has market power. We have regulatory agencies tasked with policing externalities and policing negative externalities and subsidizing positive externalities, right? So we're going to heavily subsidize preschool because it has a lot of great positive externalities. And we're going to tax pollution, and we're going to regulate out lead in our food. And then we're going to deal with information asymmetries, right, by building all sorts of certifications and rating agencies, right? We're going to send inspectors to slaughterhouses and make sure that there are sanitary practices being used. We're going to, have certifications for doctors and lawyers and teachers and all these different people to make sure that they're qualified for their jobs, right? We're going to do things to maintain public confidence that, you might not know whether the doctor you're going to is any good, but somebody has checked and told you that that doctor is good. And so the idea is, if we correct all of these market failures, we stop these sort of race to the bottom, we stop these problems with market economics, while still preserving most of the benefits of market economics. And then the last part of this general worldview is to say that we should, indeed, redistribute income, redistribute resources in a more just and equitable way, but that we should do so in a way that has the least distorting effect on our economy, right? So if you take public economics, for example, a lot of the attention is going to be on how do we have progressive taxes work in a way that does the least to reduce people's incentive to work and earn money, right? How do we produce tax systems and redistribution systems that look as much as possible like that lump sum tax and lump sum transfer, right? That shift in endowments that the second welfare theorem says we can do without having any distortive effects on the economy at all. So that's kind of one view, right? Is the market liberal view. But there's a couple other perspectives about this. Another one that you might have encountered at various times, right, is essentially a view that says the set of assumptions we're making, right, the problems with markets are so big and so profound and so pervasive in all of the interactions that markets are governing, that the real way to read the welfare theorems is to say that this entire system doesn't work, right? We can't tweak or adjust around the edges. We have to throw out the baby with the bathwater and start over with something else. What that something else is can vary tremendously, right? But essentially, whatever the alternative is that we want to devise would have to be an alternative that solves the same problems that are and are not solved by market economies themselves, right? The alternative has to be something that transmits information between different individuals and allows for complex production processes. It has to be a process that finds some way to cause people to be accountable for the consequences of their actions, right? Positive and negative. It has to be something that maintains public trust. So one approach has been essentially radical and transformative, right? You have an approach like was taken in the Soviet Union, where you say, we're going to abolish markets, we're going to start from scratch, we're going to have a year zero, we're going to build a brand new society, either under some form of central control or some sort of a narco-syndicalist perspective, where we're going to have decentralized workers' communes making decisions on a small scale that aggregate up to a large scale through mutuality and discussion and sharing. We're going to have a moral revolution to go along with the economic revolution, so that the solution to problems like externalities or information asymmetry is just that people don't act in their own self-interest, they care about their neighbors, because we've told them all how important it is that we all work together. My view of this sort of approach is that in the big picture sense, it has almost always resulted, in the past, right, when people have tried to do this before, in the very largest picture, this has normally resulted in disaster, right? The Soviet Union was a deeply dysfunctional, deeply flawed society, particularly by the time that it fell, right? If we look at Cuba and North Korea today, there are deep, deep problems in all of the societies that have attempted to do this, But at the same time, smaller scale or specific versions of this have sometimes worked really well. If you think about the British national healthcare system, that's essentially throwing out market forces entirely in the field of healthcare. Right? We say we're going to publicly provide healthcare to everyone. We're not going to worry about prices allocating healthcare to people. We're going to allocate healthcare to people by bureaucracy. We're going to decide how much doctors should be paid by bureaucracy. We're going to decide what medicines to use by bureaucracy. And the result has worked reasonably well. Many would argue better than more market-centered approaches, although that's a very long and interesting conversation by itself. You know, if you look at countries like Sweden and Norway, there's some aspects of the Swedish and Norwegian economies that are very, very free market. There's other aspects that are almost entirely state-controlled. So one way to look at the evidence of history is that doing away with markets entirely, shifting to a purely centralized model, might sometimes work on a sufficiently small scale. Now there's another possibility, if we want to throw out this entire framework, that's almost the opposite of this sort of radical transformative, right, throw everything away and start society fresh, which is to be deeply, deeply conservative with social institutions. So this is a perspective that says, if you look at all human societies, every human society has been dealing with these same challenges, right? These same challenges about how do you equitably distribute produce to your members? How do you balance risks of different individuals? How do you make sure that people are honest with each other? How do you make sure that people don't disrupt each other's lives? And so it's a perspective that says we should have as little ideology as possible. If we see that an institution exists and is working in a particular place, we should leave it alone. So we shouldn't try to impose property rights regimes in developing countries that we think will allow markets to work more effectively. We should let whatever is there now continue. Right? We should be very, very reluctant to interfere with community-based approaches to the allocation of goods, or to sharing, or to accountability. Okay. So that's kind of an alternative that says, let's throw out this entire framework. There's another set of alternatives that does the opposite, right? If neoliberalism or market liberalism says, we're going to have markets, but we're going to try to correct their failures. There's another approach, right, a more libertarian approach, that says we should let the market correct the market's failures. So the idea here is, if we think about these problems that come about, right, we think about the pizzeria throwing its grease out behind out behind its, in the back lot. We might say the best way to correct these problems is to create a market for addressing market failures. So if I'm a pizzeria that has no one stopping me from throwing my grease, and you decide you're going to open up a new mall that's going to carefully regulate the waste disposal of all of the businesses working there, my new mall is going to attract all sorts of new customers, right? And it's going to be able to deal with those externalities because from the mall's perspective, that grease isn't an externality, right? It's an internal cost. So when I have my mall and I set my regulations, I'm not going to allow that sort of thing. So this is a perspective that says a lot of these problems that we talk about can be dealt with essentially with contracts and negotiation and institutions within markets, right? If we think about why large companies exist at all, they might be in many cases about addressing information asymmetries, addressing market failures, addressing externalities. Likewise, right, if we think about the used car dealer, one of the ways we might expect to deal with that is by working with people that we trust. So if you ask, why is it that on most highways in the United States, the restaurants on the roadsides are almost all corporate branded fast food as opposed to independent? One of the reasons might be that McDonald's has a reputation to protect in a way that a small business doesn't, right? In situations where it's easy to be taken advantage of, we might end up with the market shifting in a direction that creates its own credentials, right? Creates its own proof that you're not being taken advantage of. So what the libertarian perspective on all this is to say, if you talk to someone like Joseph Schumpeter or Friedrich Hayek or Milton Friedman, what they might say about all of this is that these are problems with kind of the most idealized, right, institution-free version of markets, but they're not problems with the actual practice of free market economics. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say about political institutions and the welfare theorems. In the next video, if you're still ready for more, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas I've had about how to use these welfare theorems to think about your own role in society and how to be a good person.